Great. Welcome, everybody. We're also expecting more people to join as we go, but a big warm welcome to our webinar. ESGSignals is a business tool for corporates. This is our third webinar this summer. The first one we did with Google Cloud. We talked a little bit about leveraging our ESGSignals product for portfolio management. Our second one was targeted towards asset managers and how they can use ESG data for things like comparing different companies and making better decisions. This one is specifically targeted towards corporates. So we're going to talk a little bit more today about taking ESG data beyond assessment and measurement and actually making it a very useful business tool for corporates, especially for corporates that are trying to adhere to ESG recommendations and are actually currently actively exploring the tools that exist for them. So this is one such tool, and we're going to talk a little bit about how it could be used, some practical use cases for it, and some specific data types that might be of interest to corporates. We're also very happy to share that today's webinar is hosted not just by RSmetrics, but by our partners from Infosys as well. So one of our speakers today, Corey Glickman, is also from the Infosys team. So we're going to talk a little bit about how the two companies collaborated. It's important to know today that one of the topics we're going to be talking about is how we can use integrated ESG thinking within our processes and actually see the importance of this insightful data. So we're going to talk a little bit about why it's important to go beyond the thinking of just singular ESG topics like measuring emissions or seeing just water stress or only looking at biodiversity, and embracing this broader look, this integrated ESG thinking within the processes and why that's important for corporates right now. We're also going to talk a little bit about how using something like ESGSignals and an ESG data tool can actually allow your organization to respond to key stakeholders' legitimate needs and interests with hard and objective data. So independent data, not data that was just disclosed by a company, and how that could be used, for example, for cases like how will this capital expenditure affect different environmental and physical risk scores. And we're also going to look at how something like ESGSignals can allow your organization to respond to and tailor your ESG goals in reporting and measurement and all of these things in varying demands from your stakeholders. So we're going to look at all of these today, and we're also going to look at some use cases. But I just want to remind you that we're going to have some time for questions and answers in the end, but we want to make this really interactive. So if you have a question or an example or something you're struggling with, or just something you're curious to learn more about, feel free to use our questions section. And keep an eye on our chat where Kirti from RSmetrics is also going to be sharing some useful resources for you. And for our polls that we might be releasing throughout this presentation, because we want to get some feedback from you. We are interested to learn what's top of mind for you, what's an issue for you or for your customers. Maybe someone you've worked with has indicated that that's a really big problem for them. So we want to hear all of that. That helps us make our data better and also our products better. So keep an eye on that. And last but not least, the goal for this webinar, it's really for you to get to know ESGSignals as a product, and also to learn how it could be used for your own projects. So I hope you enjoy this and make the most of it. And we're going to move forward with our two speakers, and I'll let them both introduce themselves.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Desi. So Malcolm Harris here, background in oil and gas, in climate strategy and ESG, and you know, I'm an advisor at RSmetrics, and a lot of what I help the team think about is what is the corporate perspective on this, because in ultimately a lot of this data is foundational to corporates, right? Investors need this data, they want this data, they want good. The ability to assess climate risk, physical risk, transition risk, but they don't have it. And ultimately, it's going to have to come from the corporates, right? They're going to have to measure it, which is really where, RSmetrics and Infosys come in, right? Because again, they're providing rigorous financial data. They're not really doing that yet for ESG data, and we'll see. We'll see what that looks like in a case study that I'll talk through on Caterpillar. But there's a lot of stuff happening that that's going to drive this, right? It's not just investors demanding it, but we're seeing with the SEC, right? The SEC is implementing some, or is planning to implement some rules that are going to require a lot of this to be disclosed, and it's only going to drive, like, demand for much better data. So coming from the corporate perspective, I would love to have, at my fingertips, working corporate strategy, a good ability to assess physical risk, transition risk, both internally against competitors in an M&A context. So we'll talk about that when we get to the case study. But that's how I see this this data being used in the corporate setting, right? So Corey, you want to introduce yourself, and then we'll get into some case studies.
Certainly, and thank you. Looking forward to having this discussion, Malcolm. Thank you, Desi, for arranging for all this. So a little bit about myself. I am the head of the ESG business for Infosys, which is really much focused on how do we take the concepts of ESG into the business world. So where does that connection take place for our corporate clients and actually for governments and others? And it's very, very important in our journey that we can take both the lessons we've learned being a corporate mutual company now for 3 years, and the many practices that we've seen, and we understand the importance of data. And we understand, I believe, as well as most, what it takes for the journey for different kinds of corporations, different kinds of sectors, in order to understand what goals they need to set. How do they actually track those goals? How do they prove that it comes out? So the question is always starts with data. And we know there's a plethora of talk about data. At the simplest level, you can say it's all about big data, and we can say it's quantitative and qualitative. And there are many indexes, and it is amazing. Once you get inside, you start to peel that onion apart, and you'll say, some of it is automated, some of it is handwritten, some of it is shared, some of it is not shared. We realize the importance, though, to become systems of record, that the data becomes quantitative as much as possible. Even things that you would suspect, social data or other aspects of impact, tends to be a little bit more qualitative. How do we move those into systems of record? And what has been most exciting about this collaboration is that seeing a solution, as you'll be seeing today, and with the case studies, this is a truly viable way at a corporate enterprise level to have identifying the metrics, having data that you can act upon, and actually take it to that next level of impact. It's just not, I'm looking for something, I'm reporting what's compulsory or regulatory to say something, but I can actually use that data to make decisions that will have impact across there. And this very much aligns to the Infosys story of being practical. We look for solutions using technologies that exist today that will help companies shorten their timelines towards their goals. So I think this will be a very, very good discussion today. Thanks.
Thank you both. And just a very quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're first going to go over the very idea of ESG data solutions as business tools for companies. So how can corporate companies use ESG data and dashboards for taking better financial and process decisions, and taking it beyond just measuring the performance of, for example, emissions or proximity to specific areas like biodiversity, and actually starting to think about how this could be used to better manage and have an overall better impact. Secondly, we're going to go over the types of data within ESGSignals. As I said, we're going to see a short overview of the types of ESG data that ESGSignals has, and which ones are specifically useful for corporate customers, which ones are attracting particular attention right now, like biodiversity, for example, and how could they be used to better manage different assets. After that, Corey's going to talk about practical solutions and value realization. So we're going to see how companies can use ESGSignals data to update their decision-making processes, make better capital expenditure, investment, divestment, and competitive decisions with data that is already analysis-ready data from ESGSignals. And as I said, last, we're going to have some time for Q&A, but ask us anything as we go too. Maybe you thought of something, maybe you want to contribute something, or maybe you have just a suggestion or a comment, just drop them in the chat, and we're also going to talk about them as we go. So we can move on to ESG data solutions as business tool for companies. And Malcolm.
Awesome. Thanks, Desi. You want to move to the next slide, and I'll start from there? Okay. Thank you so much. So let me share with all of you just kind of some of the big issues from a corporate perspective with ESG data, right? So first of all, they're getting bombarded from all sides, right? So investors are asking them for this data. Regulators are pushing for it, depending on where you're located. The EU is a little bit ahead. Canada is not far behind. The SEC is catching up. So and not only that, employees are asking about it. What are we doing about our environmental footprint, right? So there's huge pressure on the C-suite to have a response and so on. But it's very hard to, it's one of those things where you have to do something, but you don't know how, right? And the way you can think about what we're offering is a way to enable this, right, for the C-suite, and more importantly, throughout the organization, right? So there's a couple things, right? So you have a global company, it's a process to measure this stuff, right? Maybe you want to assess your physical risk. You have operations in 25 countries, 200 locations. How are you going to do it, right? You're going to go out and ask each of them to conduct a risk assessment, hire consultants, right? That's costly and not time effective. And of course, as you're getting up to speed on that, right? No company just wants to understand where they stand in a vacuum, right? They want to understand where are they relative to the competition, right? Every investor presentation shows, here's company A, and here's how they're, they try to tell the story of why they're better than their competitors, right? So you understand your competitors as well as yourself, right? And then, of course, to do this effectively, right? You don't want it to just be a quick measurement exercise. You want it to this information to filter throughout the organization, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the case study on Caterpillar. But this can't be a sort of a quick data collection and reporting exercise. Our view is that this has to be very strategic, right? So how does that how does that play out, right? So as an example, looking at the solution side, typically, again, using physical risk as a nice simple example, you probably have a newly formed ESG team. They're sitting at corporate somewhere. They're probably overworked. They'll go out, try to collect some physical risk data from a provider. And where is that data going to go? It's going to go right to that ESG team and then into a report, and that's pretty much it, right? So again, there's a problem with silos, right? The data is not filtering out into operations. And again, if you think about it, if they can just sign up for a subscription, right, that includes not only their own data, they're getting their competitors, it becomes a much more accessible option for a company that's able to say, look, here's our own data. We've got it quickly. We can enhance it with new assets as we build more factories, buy other companies, right? And then, of course, you want to scale it, right? Because it's not just scaling across the organization, it's scaling across data points and different measurements, right? As technology continues to advance very quickly in the environmental space, there's a plethora of new data sources that customers are going to want to implement and incorporate into their decision-making processes. And that's where working with Google Cloud and Infosys really becomes powerful, right? Because you can start to think about how you're not just doing a one-time thing. You're sort of building something that can grow with the organization. So that's how we think about this. This in kind of democratizing access to this data from sort of a niche, limited, corporate ESG, data acquisition to something that can be spread throughout a company on an objective basis that every decision maker from, the C-level down to operational folks can use in their day-to-day. Just like, they're going to be using traditional KPIs based on financials and, units sold and those kind of things, right? So if you can go to the next slide, Desi, and I'll kind of make this a little more concrete, talking through a case study.
Definitely. And as I'm doing that, we're also curious to hear a little bit more about which ones of those factors you guys have experienced for you or your customers to be of biggest value. So feel free to answer our poll.
Great, thanks, Desi. So, Caterpillar is a great example, right? So, the ESGSignals product, we cover 6 of the really physically exposed sectors within the MSCI ACWI. So, for those of you who may not be familiar, the MSCI ACWI, think of it as like the S&P 500, but for the entire world, right? So it's about 3,000 companies, and our focus area really is the 6 sectors that are really physically exposed, both in terms of risk to their operations and, of course, their impact on the environment. So think, manufacturing, utilities, oil and gas, metals and mining, and so on. So Caterpillar is an interesting example because they're clearly taking some steps to address ESG and climate, but they based on what they disclose, they have a long way to go. So just to give you a company overview, right, I'm sure you know, they manufacture major heavy equipment for things like mining, energy, right? And of course, they have 125 facilities. They have a huge number of suppliers, which they've disclosed publicly. So it's clearly a focus area for them. And they're focused on a couple areas within the ESG lens, right? So emissions is a big one for them because they're focused on, they sell these big energy intensive products like huge trucks to mining companies that burn a lot of diesel, so they have to think through where do they stand in a changing regulatory and policy environment. Water is a big deal for them. Waste, recycling, right? They're focused on circular economy, which is a big focus area of Corey and his team, I know. And safety, right? Safety is important. But one thing you notice if you've been in coming from corporate ESG perspective, there's some significant gaps, right? Like as I mentioned, they have 125 facilities, right? If you look at their balance sheet, that's about $12 billion depreciated. So replacement value is probably quite a bit more. And one thing you as a corporate definitely want to understand is where are your big physical risks, right? Which are the facilities that will potentially be impacted by flood, fire under certain climate scenarios. And these are exactly the things we offer in the platform, right? The ability to see through that lens and assess at a strategic level where are the risks in my portfolio of manufacturing facilities, right? And that's basically step one. And I should mention, if you look at the quote up ahead, they've publicly committed to putting out a TCFD aligned report, right? And one of the demands, if you will, of TCFD is that you disclose an assessment of physical risk to your operations, right? So they basically publicly committed to put themselves on the hook for this assessment, right? And if you look at their what they disclose about themselves, their facilities obviously are an issue. They should assess that, but they really, if we've learned anything from COVID, it's that supply chains are increasingly problematic, right? So they would, in theory, if I were them sitting in their shoes, I'd want to be doing the same thing for all my suppliers, right? So when I do my sort of vendor assessment and think who's going to be supplying me with raw materials, components to my equipment, right? I would certainly want to understand who's at risk of flooding, who's at risk of, fire, and even more sort of things like heat wave, which if we look at, the ECB's recent climate assessment of banks, they pointed out that, heat waves can have a significant impact on productivity, right? So we see all kinds of potential impacts that you really want to have visibility into, right? So it's not just, and again, I point to suppliers because it's not just a sort of a disclosure exercise that someone like Caterpillar should be doing. It should be really a data-centric approach that filters across the corporate operations, right? By the way, I'm not picking on Caterpillar. Every company is sort of in this ESG and climate journey. They're trying to understand where they are and going forward. But one thing to note, of course, is they've at least recognized, hey, physical risk is an issue. We're going to start to address that. They haven't said anything about biodiversity, right? And a company like Caterpillar, both in terms of manufacturing and supply chain, likely has a significant biodiversity component, both in terms of their dependence on the environment. And we see they've mentioned water, right? So water is a key dependence area within the TNFD biodiversity framework, and also, of course, their impact on the environment. And that's another thing that someone like Caterpillar could very easily subscribe to, right? They could simply get a subscription to ESGSignals, and they would have that biodiversity footprint for their entire operations, right? So again, we're making it very easy to access this data, which I think is as important as the fact that what we're providing is a comprehensive and objective baseline of your operations. The ease of access and ability to filter throughout the company is just as important. Desi, next slide, if you could. So this is, and this speaks to that point I was just mentioning, right? So if you think about, again, how if you look at the quote on top, clearly this is a very high priority topic. The CEO and the execs are involved, but in practice, in many cases, the process is complex and quite siloed. So, as I was mentioning, you have your chief sustainability officer up top who might go out and get some of this data, put it in the sustainability report, maybe in the 10K if they think they want to do that. And a lot of times it doesn't filter down into the operations, right? And Corey will get into this because this is really where, Infosys is bringing this all together, right? You as a, let's say, a procurement person want to assess these risks in your supply chain. You also want to look at in your customers, right? In two ways, right? One is the fact that customers are increasingly demanding that their suppliers tell them about their environmental footprint, their biodiversity footprint, their emissions, right? So they want to have the data at their fingertips. So the sales team, in other words, wants to be able to go to their customers and say, hey, here's our performance, here's why we're better than the competitors, right? So you want this data to filter down to the commercial side. You don't want it to be a reporting asset that sits at a corporate ESG team. You want this to be, driving commercial success for a company like Caterpillar. And of course, someone like Caterpillar on that end also is lending, right? They're lending to a lot of their customers. So they probably want to be assessing the same kind of physical, biodiversity, environmental risk among their, and bake that into their lending decisions, right? Who do they provide credit to, and who do they think is too much of a risk from biodiversity perspective, physical risk perspective, credit perspective, right? So the idea is that all of this data should be available across the company, right? Because again, we don't want this to be a checkbox exercise. We want this to be strategic. We want this to be integrated. And that's really, where the market is going, right? As people, especially on the investing side, as companies get more and more sophisticated, they're not looking for a nice, shiny sustainability report. They're looking for real evidence that a company like Caterpillar is really integrating this across their operations and driving value, right? And so that's what we see this, our platform with Google and Infosys offering, right? It's that ability for people across the company to access the data and drive really good decisions with it. So next slide, Desi. And just keep going till the next one. So there's kind of two layers to this. One is the fact that we want this data to be available across the company, and two, we want it to be comprehensive, right? One of the other challenges in terms of data silos is not just that the data is siloed within a particular group or organization within a company, but also there's frequently multiple data sources, assuming they're collecting this data and measuring this data at all, and that becomes its own kind of challenge, right? So one thing that's important for us to offer is this comprehensive perspective where anyone at this company has all the necessary environmental data at their fingertips, right? Whether it's biodiversity, water stress, physical risk, right? One of the challenges many companies have, especially in these physically exposed sectors, is that they're not good at bringing in multiple data sources together and combining them. It's not it hasn't always been their core skill set. Even though they're aware they should be doing this, it doesn't come naturally, right? So one thing we've done, and part of the value prop, is having all this data in one place, right? So you can go into our platform, you can get any metric you want, right? Whether it's, again, biodiversity, water stress, land use, forward-looking physical risk indicators like heat wave, flood. And the point is, again, anyone in the company will be able to access anything they need. And not only that, if the company has existing geospatial data that they want to layer in for their own analysis, they can do that. And of course, I think that the final point I would mention that's super important is so much technology is rushing in to fill the huge gaps we see in measurement of environmental performance, whether it's satellites measuring heat in businesses, or just in buildings, or just different on the ground measurements that people are conducting. And what we offer is the ability to bring those in, right? We're well aware that there's going to be more and more data sets that companies are going to find valuable. And part of the offering is simply the ability to bring all that stuff in. So at the end of the day, a corporate, the C-level is able to make decisions not based on one metric, but multiple, right? So if you look at, one thing you may have seen in the news recently was The Economist had a big headline. It had ESG on the cover, and it said we should only measure emissions, right? And I would argue that's completely wrong. If you think about it, if you're a company that has a certain number of assets, let's say 100 assets, you might, by that measure, using The Economist's approach, you might just say, hey, look, let's take the 10 worst emitting assets and get rid of them, right? But if you're doing a comprehensive assessment, you're going to say, look, those high emitting assets have, very little physical risk, very little biodiversity footprint, supply chain looks good. We actually want to invest in reducing those emissions, right? So what we see is companies, as they get more and more a grasp on the whole ESG landscape, what's going to happen is they're going to make better decisions, right? Not based on one environmental metric, but a comprehensive set. And going forward, what we'll see is they'll be hopefully using our platform to make those decisions. Corey, go ahead. I see you got your hand up.
So I want to actually expand a little bit on what you're saying and get your feedback. I can't agree with you more about the economists, and that's one of our partners, with that statement, because if you look at the true stress of what corporations and supply chain, especially if we look at Europe and what's happening with population shifts and supply chain breakdowns, those are social aspects, right, that are forcing the stress in those systems that are going to ultimately impact environmental decisions, scheduling decisions, so forth. So just kind of your thoughts a little bit about, the impact of social that we recognize. It's always about population shift. Can existing cities or the supply chain keep up with the increased demand? And with this idea of signals and not looking at just the environmental measurement, but the other factors that impact this I think is a vital discussion.
Yeah, Corey, no, I totally agree as well. And I think what we're seeing is that the E is starting to merge with the S a little bit. Like, so for example, I was mentioning the ECB's climate stress test, right? They were saying, look, like one of the key risks is heat waves. And part of it is because that substantially impacts productivity in things like manufacturing, outdoor activities like agriculture and construction, right? Which are all, key components of the economy. Not only that, if you look at things like heat wave and water stress, let's say you're setting up your office in Phoenix, right? I mean, this is an area where, if the heat continues to get worse, if drought continues to get worse, your employees, A, are going to be, a little bit miserable, and two, that could affect house values, which is essentially a pay cut for your employees. So what do? Do you either pay them more or move them, right? This is stuff that affects your bottom line. So I think, where all this is going is companies are going to figure out how to translate this into dollar terms. And I think the social is one key aspect of that, right? I mean, think of agricultural supply chains. If you see what's happening in India, for example, Manish could probably speak to that later. I see a lot of this stuff is very much impacting the social, and totally agree, right? I think you get a lot of pushback and saying, hey, E and S and G, they're also different. And, there's some truth to that, but I think there's also a lot of truth to the fact that this stuff is all starting to tie together.
Yeah.
And that's a great way to hand over to Corey. Do you want to? Let's just to give you a sense before Corey takes over. So this is a one way to consume the data, right? In terms of a dashboard. And again, what this and we can certainly anyone who's interested, we can certainly show you in a demo what this looks like in practice. But what this is a screenshot of someone who's looking at a couple companies at an asset level and just assessing them on 2 scores, right? Again, we offer a whole suite of environmental metrics. This is, for ease of visual use, this is, just has 2, but you can very easily assess your own operations, right? Where the water stressed, facilities, where are the ones that are exposed to fire. And this is kind of the visibility that, this would give you. You could imagine this could be you as a company, let's say Caterpillar, but also Caterpillar's competitors. And you have a very real an actionable look at, which facilities do we need to focus CapEx on, which areas do we need to think about divesting, investing, et cetera. So that's that's one way to use it. Obviously, the use cases are multiple, but this is just one way to illustrate how a company or an investor might use this data to assess risk within their set of assets. And with that, I'll turn it over to Corey, because I know Corey has lots of really interesting stuff to share with us from his perspective.
Well, it would be hard to follow up on that great presentation, and I just don't say that to be complimentary. I mean, truly was very good. So what I'm going to do is 2 things. One, I want to talk a little bit about the partnership between the 3 of us, because I think that's important to understand, because that's how this all works. And then secondly, we're going to drill down specifically into manufacturing to tie into the case study that we've heard here, although I think it's easy for us to understand the expansion of why this could go beyond just manufacturing. On the first point here, what I'm most impressed with is the partnership between Ars Metrics, Google, and Infosys on this. And not just because we're all on the phone together and we're all partners, but if you look at this, you have 3 companies with 3 parts of the puzzle, right? And there'll be many more that I think in a record amount of time have created a very, very useful and highly advanced practical solution that can be applied right now. And I give all the credit to Ars Metrics with the complexities of how this vision of data and actually pulling the technologies together. I would say with Google as a partner, the fact that they have been able to put this into their carbon zero environment, so that we know that when we deploy these solutions, we're not adding to the carbon footprint, and it's tools that are accessible globally across here. And then from the Infosys side, the fact that we can help scale, right? And we can understand not just to create business, but the larger pot of companies that participate through all three of our venues and opportunities is going to just add to the whole with the data. So this is an extremely important model that we hear a lot about, ecosystems working together. This is a working model of an ecosystem that is bringing a solution to market, that if any one of us solo tried to do it, we'd probably be sitting here for another year waiting for something to happen, right? So that would be my first statement. Second point here is we'll talk specifically around the manufacturing. At a high level, we know that as companies are seeking to move towards impact, there's always four segments or a pattern of four things that has to happen. It always starts with data. How can I recognize what is the data that I need to understand? How do I collect that data? How do I use that data in systems of record? And ultimately, how does that data survive audits? And ultimately, where does the impact take place? That data then leads to how do things get financed? How will these programs actually be acted upon? Because as Malcolm was saying, determining on what your data is and what that impact measurement is, it's going to determine how can you fund programs, how will companies be able to make this transition to support the economies that they have to survive as businesses and actually to grow their businesses. And it does come down to data, whether that is a bank that's saying we're looking across a portfolio, or we're making the decisions of credit levels based off of one company situation versus another. They need data to understand that. The companies themselves have to understand, if I make changes of value, that if I'm going to start doing something differently, make investments in certain areas, determine I'll be operating in a different function, those are changes of value. So they're giving up some things they've been doing in the past, they're doing some things new, and those are important decisions, but they all can be capitalized in a positive way. You can only do that with data, and you need that holistic view of data. And then there's the technology decisions ultimately, right? Which physical technologies I look at deploying, which digital technologies, and then there's the whole cultural aspect. So without the data and without these other aspects, if we can't get the culture to adjust across there. So when we look at this at a high level, when I relate it to how Infosys traditionally thinks about working with many of our clients across the globe in the area of manufacturing, if I were to say Caterpillar fits in that category, we have a long history of doing things pretty advanced. And we would say, 10 years ago, it was about lean manufacturing and very much how do you push that agenda to the benefit to clients and so forth. And then years ago, we really led the way with the idea of Industry 4.0, working with the University of Aachen and saying, well, how does that change? What are the best methodologies when it comes to Industry 4.0 and starting to rethink? And then one of the big questions that's coming up now is this idea of circular PLM and the circular economy. And what does it mean in order to manufacturing? Does that compete with Industry 4.0? Does it challenge lean manufacturing? The fact is it does alter it. And now, if you don't have good data and if you don't have good practices, you could say, well, lean manufacturing could argue against some of the aspects of what you would want to do with circular economics. But if you can actually start looking how through data these would work together and how that value change would take place, it becomes a very powerful next step evolution. And the data is what's going to drive these changes across here. So what we see in this circle here are all the areas when we think about circular PLM, and these are the decision points that we have to come across here. If we go to the next slide, I'll actually give a little data of what to expect to see by using this information. So if we think of frameworks around energy efficiency and optimization, we certainly know there's more than just energy efficiency when we look at areas. But this is what's interesting, is that if you can start looking at the energy efficiency savings in particular, it will be the first thing that is recognized and often will fund and create the confidence to really expand upon what this whole thing can be. So I've broken it into 4 categories: maintenance and efficiency, operations efficiency, information efficiency, and then the energy efficiency. So when we look at maintenance efficiency, as we start applying these ideas of powerful ESG data combined with Industry 4.0, we start looking at objects such as condition monitoring versus scheduling monitoring. You just don't do things because it's on schedule. You do things because you have the data that says what is happening, and you also have data that says what could possibly happen in the future. So I can start making decisions of, do I look at schedule as compared to energy, to carbon, to the ability for the supply chain to deliver? If I have that data, I can be much more accurate of what's happening on here. I can classify my assets across here. I can understand root cause analysis when there are anomalies that happen in every system. And I also understand what's the maintenance productivity taking across here. And what we've seen over a large swath of these clients is that on average, we see a 20 to 30% supply chain efficiency take place. Those are hard, realistic numbers that are provable because the data is there. Now, in the second category around operations efficiency, we're talking about performance optimization. So how do I get the most, out of the systems that I've created here? How can I deal with my production planning and scheduling, which I find is one of the largest challenges for any manufacturing system. They have their line set up. They're all set up to produce a certain type of product in a certain time frame, and something has changed. Either part of the raw materials aren't there, or the order has changed. And to retool and to rethink that, this is where you start using things like AI and digital twins to do predictive analysis, but this is still the hardest thing to happen within there. So once again, data in real time or data that's predictive will eliminate many of those stresses. Not all of them, but many of them. Quality control, certainly, and quality control now means something more than just, say, efficacy of a product. It also means the resulting carbon, the resulting waste, and other ways that we're now measuring through here. The idea of augmented reality tools are very, very important through here, and they help. However, if you can get this data that would give you the same information that augmented reality is, that's important to understand too, because as sexy as augmented reality is, it also is got a large footprint, right? So we use it where it's necessary, but if we can get the same results through data and other means, other ways of visualizing that data, then we're doing also something that's reducing carbon footprint and energy. And then, of course, the factory, viability components. So when we look at doing this, we can actually increase equipment life lines by 20 to 40%. And this is really, really, fascinating to us, because the longer equipment is useful and valuable and doesn't end up, in some storage room we were talking about earlier, or, secondary storage place, it means we're once again not filling our landfills. We are optimizing our equipment as long as possible. And honestly, we're moving more towards things as a service then, and servitude kind of models, which are extremely efficient, which leads to information efficacy. So it all starts with, if you can't trust your data, then what are you working with? So understanding the standards, understanding how the interoperability happens between many vendors, tier 1s, tier 2s, tier 3s in your value chain. How secure is it? Is it recognized by universal standards? How can I understand what's taking place through visualization? How it can be analyzed and used for that analysis coming across there? And then using knowledge-based engineering as that next generation. When you do this, your energy and your operational efficiencies, you'll see 20 to 25% savings through here. And then the last part is the energy efficiency. So we are constantly being able to monitor our energy. Hopefully, we're deciding also to use energy that's renewable, sources that are coming into our systems. It's not always our option, but we try to push this wherever possible. How do we do the energy management? How do we think of transitions? What are the standards, compliances? And that goes from region to region, corporation to corporation through here. And then also, how do we deal with waste reduction? So pretty much we know that as we apply energy, we're talking to 5 to 10% savings across here. When we start to combine all of these areas, it's a clear case of why this should be taking place. And it forces that evolution from lean to Industry 4.0 to now Industry 4.0 that drives in a circular approach through here, and it all starts with the data, and it starts with the data that is more than just saying, I understand how much carbon is coming in and out, or maybe how much energy is taking place, but all of the aspects that Malcolm was talking about of giving a more holistic picture and being able to be flexible to understand that all data models are constantly changing across there, and being able to react or predict across there is really where the power starts taking place for here. I think the number one question that we continuously see when we talk with our clients and corporations about supply chain, manufacturing, they're saying, I need to have more data than what I've seen. Kind of picture in your head that we've always seen the middle. We understand when something's being produced, but we're not sure where the sourcing is taking place, and we're not sure what happens at the end of life cycle. We're now being asked to report and require on that, and this is the data that's going to provide those extensions in both those ends.
Yes. Corey, I actually have a comment and a question. So, put on a CEO hat, right? You're getting numbers, you're trying to increase efficiency across all these different areas. But isn't benchmarking a key part of that efficiency when you're actually benchmarking? So in Malcolm's case, if he's at Chevron or Exxon, aren't you benchmarking a particular asset against all the assets globally and figuring out what the best practices are? Does that come up? And both for you and Malcolm, really, how do companies really benchmark emissions across an asset, water usage, land usage, each of the metrics that are critical to the ESG journey for these corporates?
Yeah, and that's a good softball question, of course. So it's about baselining, right? How do you know where you're moving to unless you know, your starting point, and it's a requirement, right? It's as sufficient as anything else. So being able to baseline what you currently have, but in supply chain also, how do you get the baselines of all the other partners and components to understand what is that big picture? Then ultimately the extension of, so now that you have that baseline, that starts that whole value chain discussion that says, as I set ambitious goals, which I'm required to do, and as I understand what regulatory components are and understand where my risks are involved through here, this is going to affect my financing, this is going to affect my operations, this is going to affect who I choose to work with, and this is going to prove the things that I try or the things that I make adjustments to those value points are actually having that impact across there. And data collection is the hardest part. We both know that, because there are ways that you could start with the baseline of that data that I could say, I've run this system, I've come across it, but the continuous collection of data or recognizing the changes of that data and getting those input into the systems of record, that's what needs to ease up so that decisions can be made. And our experience is this. It's a little bit like DevOps in theory. How often do you need to see the data? It all depends on your industry and what you're doing, because you need to have enough of a time span, right, to say, I'm seeing a sharp trend, how do I react to that now, or do I need to see a longer period of time? And a longer period of time, I would say, is no longer than 8 months to a year, based off of how we see our reporting. I'd say in most cases, you might want to look at the data consistently every day to say what's happening, but the reaction to that data, you might want to look at a quarterly basis, because you could be having a bad hot month, or equipment might be down, or prices could be temporarily up. And the quick adjustments, reactions that you might pull in place may do more harm than good, right? If you don't understand the bigger picture across there. And this all then ties to the carbon economy discussion that says, now how many offsets do I have to apply based off my investments? So we need that longer picture. You can never have too much data, but you need to know which data is relevant, at a given point of time and when to act upon it.
Thanks, Corey. That's a really good point. And I think with that and with also Manish's question, I think it's time to move more towards our Q&A session and really open this up to discussion. So feel free to use either our chat. We also have a Q&A section happening, but also you can also just turn on your microphone and ask us a question live. And as that's happening, also feel free to follow us and join our network on LinkedIn. We have a lot of ESG professionals there. So if you don't have the question now, maybe you'd like to ask it to us later or do it under a comment. A big thank you to Malcolm Harris, who is our presenter from RS Metrics, and for all the insightful information he provided. And now it's up to you. what are you interested in to know more about? And what are some issues you have encountered either with clients, customers, or within your own companies? And I'm actually going to open this with a question towards, I guess it's more towards Manish, but also Corey too, is how can people get this data? What sort of, besides the dashboard that Malcolm shared, is that the only way people can get this data? Can you talk a little bit more about where they can find it and what formats they can find it in?
Sure. Thanks, Desi, and thank you, Corey. That was super informative. I know we can go on and on and on about the different use cases. So a little bit also about the history of RS Metrics. I'm sure some of you have helped with us before, have been clients, partners of ours. We've been doing this for almost 12 years. We've been providing accurate, large-scale geospatial data since 2010, primarily to the financial services market, but since 2019, when we launched ESGSignals to the broader sectors which we cover, as Malcolm mentioned during MSCI Equity. So there are 2 or 3 ways you can get the data. The first is through our partnership with GCP. GCP is the Google Cloud Platform, and that's the partnership that Corey and Malcolm were alluding to. So GCP has a marketplace where you can get our data. The second part is you can go, if you or any of your clients have some kind of a GCP agreement and some kind of a GCP commit or spend, then the data you're getting from us as a DaaS, data as a service, will count towards that. The second part is if you want to actually go create applications around this, as Corey was mentioning, put in the processes, operationalize some of the best practices that you want to go along with the data. That's where Infosys, with all its experience in implementing large-scale complex solutions, comes in. You take the data, you come in with Infosys, you get the best practices, and obviously you still have the ability to consume data directly via us, and we're hosting a lot of this on GCP. And lastly, we also have a lot of our financial data resellers who you're familiar with, the Bloombergs of the world, CME, Chicago Mercantile Exchange. If some of you are joining from Asia, SGX, NASDAQ, etc. So a lot of different ways to get data, but I also want to say it's not just data, right? A lot of it has to be operationalized into some kind of a software, which is then open to all the different participants in the ecosystem, and especially within the company who want access to the same type of reference data and also contribute towards it.
Thanks, Manish. And then another question, I guess it's a broader one. We have addressed it a little bit, but we saw an example from the sphere of manufacturing. But what other sectors and industry can use ESGSignals best for their purposes? And also, if you could talk a little bit more about where do you see this being really, really important beyond manufacturing?
Yeah. So, from our perspective, when we started doing this, we really focused on the 6 sectors which were the most critical, both from a material perspective and also contributed the most towards sustainability and environmental and climate risks. So manufacturing is obviously a big sector, but consumer discretionary, which includes some part of manufacturing, refrigerators, washing machines, cars, automobiles, is one sector. The material sector is another big contributor and also a big user. The material sector would include all the different mining companies, metal companies, coal companies, and obviously the energy sector, which is where Malcolm is from, which includes the vertically integrated oil companies that you've seen been in the news a lot. And then going into from energy to utilities, you'll see a lot of usage in utilities as the world moves from a fossil fuel powered utility generation to actually tracking what are going to be probably one of the biggest risks, which is in utilities transition risk, right? So I think Corey or Malcolm might have mentioned in Europe with the war going on in Ukraine, some of the countries are thinking of refiring up the coal plants or building up coal plants. What's the transition risk at an asset level if you actually do that? How does that translate to the financiers of those plants? So out of all the sectors, we cover 11 sectors. I think the 6 sectors that I mentioned here are the key ones, and they all have access through our partners, Infosys and Google. They all have access to the data that we have, which is reference data used for baselining, as Corey put it, and also for benchmarking. Mm-hmm. Corey, what do you think? And I'd love to hear other people too.
Yeah, I would love to hear other people's lists too. But yeah, I would concur. And what's interesting about the list, it's all of the industries that have the hardest path to go forward, right? The companies that are mostly digital, they have different challenges and things, but we're talking about companies that say we are always going to produce carbon and we're always going to be subject to what's happening from a supply chain and manufacturing component. And so you're taking on the hardest problems, but I always believe that the harder problems to solve come up with the best solutions, right? Because the ones that have to be addressed. So for, let's just say, the companies that truly matter, the ones that are making us, have materials and heat and energy and all these areas, this is what's important to solve. The secondary part, although we didn't name it, is the financial services industry, right? Because all of this ultimately, there's how do you fund this and how do companies know how this is going to impact the value of the companies? So this same data is so important, whether it's private equity, whether it's banks, whether it's capital market programs, they're going to use this just as much in order to understand this. I cannot think of a single project that we would go into any one of these major sectors that you've talked about that they're going to say, now show me the value realization case and help me understand how we're going to be able to fund and finance and what's this going to do for my audits and levels. So the use of the data is also going to be very, very important, to all of the other parts of the value chain that these companies need.
Thank you both. I think that's really important to also think about, like just taking it outside our use cases, like where could this be used the most? I then have another question. I guess it's to both of you, but what do you see as the biggest competitor to this type of data, this type of business to as ESG signals?
I'll go first, just from my perspective. I wouldn't frame it as a competitor to say this product is better than this product. I would say the competition is how companies choose to get their data. And right now, the default is I'm going to go scrape data publicly from somewhere, right? Because I can access that, and there's just a lot of reasons why I can do this. And that is important data, but it doesn't get you to that level of differentiation. The other aspect that we see is that when you look at a value chain, that value chain, different components are only going to release a certain amount of levels of data, because I think there's this fear of reverse engineering if you learn too much about everything, within a complex system. So having strong data that gets you to that next level beyond just scraping data, that actually can provide value in a source that everybody recognizes. These are the baselines. This is what we have to deal with. These are the decision points. I would say it's more of quality of data is the competitor, versus another product out there. Not to say there aren't other good products out there, and hopefully there are, because the more of this that's out there, the more we're going to benefit. But I think most companies are going to say, do I go with a product like this, or can I scrape data publicly from somewhere and get away with it? That's what I see.
Got it. Thank you. Anish, do you have anything to add? You're muted.
One of us always has to be muted. I would say it's inertia, right? If you're it's what Corey said. There's multiple data sources, but the history of ESG has always been the bigger organizations, the rating organizations, either getting data from two ways. One is corporate surveys, and we all know corporations like these are not super good with data. If you have 10,000 assets across the world, are you measuring everything at an asset level? You might have data from 2018, 2019, 2021. The data is in different formats. It's totally different. So the biggest issue, I think, is around inertia, around quality of data. How do you get data which is comparable across all areas? So you don't actually have to spend years and years cleaning the data up. The last part is a lot of companies are also, as Corey said, trying to figure out if they can do it themselves, right? Can they spend 10 years developing what we've been doing, leveraging geospatial for the past 10 years, leveraging, trillions and trillions of pixels that we've analyzed. So, but finally, I think the companies are getting to a point where they're seeing, here's an architected solution. It's easily accessible as data as a service, and it's, integrated into their own needs and their own ESG journey. I think Soumya Ranjan had a question.
Yes, definitely.
Thanks, Manish. Yeah, I do have a question and a follow-up. So I would like to get insights of Corey. I work underneath Corey, so I would like to ask a question to Corey as well as a follow-up question to Manish. So the question is, both ESG and CSR are business social responsibility, right? So what are the key ESG metrics which will contribute significantly to the CSR goal? That's one question. And how those can be quantified and measured? That's my first part of the questions. And a follow-up question to Manish. Can we consider ESGSignal platform as a market-ready product to collect information from various sources and ensure all critical metrics are quantified and measured? And if it has the ability to publish an insightful business report? So these are the two questions. Over to you, Corey and Manish.
Okay, nice, simple question. So I'll try to do the best I can on the first part here. So the first statement about how do the ESG data components translate or support to the CSR part of the equation here. And it is a great question because why does CSR take place? I guess is where I would start. If I look at what is that end goal, CSR is certainly a corporate social responsibility, but in all transparency, many companies will do this, but the real reason why we're looking at it, it's a way of offsets, and it's a way of balancing out, across there. And these are very important programs to take place. So they will look for specific kinds of data in order to either based on what industry they're in or geographically where they're located, or perhaps where the zones where CSR can take place and be accounted for to be measurable through here. So for instance, much CSR, as we know, takes place in India because it's a great zone for it, and some can take place in, in the Amazon, and some in the Nordics, and some in Singapore. But there are other, geographies like Australia where it's very hard to do a CSR program. It's just not set up, to do this. So they have to almost export it across there. So I think it's done by which company it is, what sector they're in, what they socially might be geographically located, and then certainly what the company's aspects are. So if I reverse engineer it, it could be climate related, it could be biodiversity related, it could be supply chain related, it could be economic driven. So they'll look at it across there. I think one of the aspects that this has to hold up for, though, is regardless of any of those, that data for CSR programs has to be third-party validated, right? It's not enough to just say I'm doing biodiversity in a forest. There's a whole marketplace of CSR out there now, but they have to be validated, saying that if I'm actually am doing water control systems, sheds, or I'm putting up trees, or I'm doing other things that are changing the economics, they just can't take your word for it. It has to be third-party certified. So this data has to hold up for this across there. So it's another piece of the puzzle that comes across. But every company has to start that from day one to say, if these are my goals, and I'm going to use this as part of my solution, I also have to say, how much of it do I think I'm going to need to predict I'm going to need to buy or to invest in it in order for all this to work together. So that's my view. I don't know. Manish, yours?
Yeah, I think that, great question. I would say it depends on the industry. We have, Desi, I don't know if I can share this, but as Desi and Corey and Malcolm were mentioning, we have over 50 different metrics that we provide for each asset, right? So if you have integrated thinking, you're an oil and gas company, you might identify within all your assets, going through a root cause analysis, that biodiversity loss in your refineries is a big area, right? Or you might identify air quality, as Corey mentioned. Air quality is a big deal in countries like India, or you might actually identify just emissions, right? So depending on which metrics you choose and what you're baselining and benchmarking against, you have the ability here to go create a program and a process where you can baseline yourself and then benchmark yourself against what you would consider our competitors and best practices in the industry and also beyond the industry. But it all starts with, what we mentioned again and again, is objective data, which is verifiable and which is real time and which is comparable across all areas. So, Desi, I know I have to be cognizant of time. I know you're getting to the point.
You had a second question, though, important question. Is this ready? This isn't vaporware. This is available right now.
Oh, yes. We've been working on this for a very long time. We have customers across all the different sectors that you've mentioned, and we're going to market with partners such as Google, Infosys, and a lot of our other partners. Yeah. So please reach out. We'd love to have Infosys and all you other, a lot of other people on the call. Please, do reach out. That's part of why we do these webinars, to get the word out.
Absolutely. And thank you both, Corey and Manish, for handling our Q&A session. If anyone else has any other questions, you know where to find us. You can either find us on social media, and Kirti's right now sharing all the resources, as well as an email address where you can reach out to, and we'd be happy to answer any other questions you might have. We want to be also considerate of time. So thank you so much for all of you who joined us today to learn more about ESG signals and how it could be used as a business tool for corporates. We hope you learn more about the product, and also for some different ways in which it could be used and implemented within the existing processes of corporates. A big thank you to Corey and Infosys for being part of our webinar. We were very happy to have you, and we are looking forward to more collaborations in the future. And we will share with you a recording of this webinar as well. But just wanted to thank all of you for contributing your questions, your presence, and for our speakers, Corey, Manish, and also Malcolm. Thank you, and we hope you have a great day.